Hello everyone, welcome to our next video, and today we're going to start with sexual reproduction part. In our previous video we had done asexual reproduction. So in sexual reproduction, the first question is, what was the requirement of developing sexual reproduction through evolution? Because asexual reproduction itself was doing the job of producing new organisms and also giving a good amount of variation into it. Now with sexual reproduction, what comes into play is a huge amount of variation, because there are two parents. So the first parent will have his own variation during the DNA copying procedure, and the second parent will also have its own variation during its DNA copying procedure. So both of them have their own DNA copying mistakes or errors that create variation, and then they combine to form a zygote. So as a result of that, 50% of one parent and 50% of the other combine to give rise to a new zygote, which will grow on to become a new organism. So the variation is many folds higher than in case of asexual reproduction. So that is why when the variation becomes very high, the survival chance becomes higher as well. So with complex organisms, or means higher order organisms, like for example human beings or any other animal that you see around yourself, these animals are multicellular higher order organisms, and they all follow sexual reproduction, not asexual reproduction. They follow sexual reproduction, and by sexual reproduction they can produce more amount of variation, and hence their chances of survival is also higher than that of asexually reproducing organisms. So now the thing is, we don't have the sexual reproduction in human beings as a part of the syllabus this year in 2020, but we have the sexual reproduction part in case of flowering plants. So in flowering plants, the reproductive organ of the plant is the flower, and in the flower the reproductive parts are the stamen and the carpel, or you can say the pistil. So let's look into the flower. So you can look at the picture that I have attached here. This is the picture from the book, the NCERT book. So there are four major parts of a flower: the carpel, the So there are four major parts of the flower, and it starts with the sepal, the petal, the stamen and the carpel, or you can call the carpel also as pistil. So the sepal, what is the role of a sepal? The sepal actually protects the bud. While the flower is actually a bud, it protects the bud from any harm from the external environment. So it acts as a support to the bud. Then we have petals. Now what is the function of petal? Petal is always colorful. If you see in any flower, there are different varieties of colors in different flowers. Now the main reason why petals are colorful is to attract pollinators. I hope you know about pollinators and pollination, you have studied in your lower classes. So they attract pollinators so that cross pollination or even self pollination is possible. So there is the function of petal and sepal. Now we move on to the two most important parts in this chapter, that is the pistil and the stamen. Now pistil is the female reproductive part and stamen is the male reproductive part. So in stamen we have this sort of structure, as you can see in the diagram also. So let me remove the diagram. So in stamen we have a thin tube like structure, and we have two bags attached here, and they contain granular structures called the pollen grains, which are known to you. So this is called the filament, and this structure is called the anther. So the anther contains the pollen grains. So the pollen grains will ultimately cause the reproduction or the fertilization or pollination in case of flowering plants. So this is the filament part, this is the anther part. The filament holds the anther holds or carries all the pollen grains. Now these pollen grains will fall into the carpel. Now what are the parts of a carpel? So if you look into the parts of a carpel, it goes something like this and then develops into a bulge at the bottom, and this part is called the stigma, this is the style, and this is the ovary, and the ovary contains some small structures, seed like structures called the ovules, which we will look into in a few minutes. So these are the two. This is the male reproductive part and this is the female reproductive part. Now how does the pollination take place? So whenever there is a pollinator into action, the anther breaks, the pollen grains come out, and these pollen grains, once they come out, they will fall into the stigma. After falling into the stigma, there actually occurs a recognition processing. Now, by recognition processing, I mean that you cannot have fertilization between any two flowers. They need to be of the same species, then only they can reproduce. So, suppose you have a China rose and the pollen grain from one China rose falls into the pollen grain of the other China rose. In that case, fertilization will take place. But if the pollen grain of a China rose falls into the pollen grain, into the stigma of a rose, in that case you can't do it, or for any other flower for that instance. So, what we have here, the pollen grains will come, it will fall into the stigma. Here recognition process will take place. If the stigma recognizes it as its own species, in that case what will happen? A chemical signal will be sent, and through the chemical signal a tube will be formed here, and this tube is called the pollen tube. So, what happens here? Through this tube, the pollen grain that has fallen here, this pollen grain will enter the stigma or the style through this tube, and ultimately this tube will come in and enter into the ovary to fertilize the ovary. So, that is how the path of pollen grain occurs inside a carpel or a pistil. So, this is a pistil. This together is called a stamen, and this here is called a pistil, or you can also call it carpel. Just two names. So, that is how the fertilization process takes place. Now, one more thing you need to know, very interesting fact, is that the size of the pollen grain and the size and the width of the pollen tube are actually same. This is to allow one pollen grain to enter at a time, so that only one pollen grain can fertilize the ovary. So, the multiple fertilization does not take place, because that will create many other complications. So, let us not move into that, we will talk about that in some other video, extra videos. So, here only one pollen grain is allowed to enter at a time to fertilize the ovary. So, now what happens after fertilization? What is the fate of these parts in fertilization? So, after fertilization, the petals, the sepals, the stamen, and this part, the style and stigma, they will fall off. What remains is the ovary and these ovules. These ovules will develop onto becoming seeds, and the ovary will develop into the fruit part. So, the fruit will actually protect the seeds inside until the seeds become matured enough to germinate. Germinate means the seeds will become matured, and then they will be able to form new plants. The seedlings will be formed. So, this process is called germination. Until the seeds are matured enough to germinate, they will be protected by the fruit, which is actually the ovary. The ovary will turn into the fruit. So, that is how the fertilization process takes place and how a new zygote is formed and a new plant will be grown from that. Now, inside the seed, there is a part called the cotyledon. So, if you look into that, the diagram is given in your book as well. There are two lobes. There may be two or one, that depends on what type of a plant it is. Okay, and you will have two extensions, one at the top, one at the bottom. These two are called cotyledons, and they are responsible for nourishing the seed. They will contain the food particles that will be able to nourish the seed. This part is called the plumule, and plumule grows into shoot of the plant, and this lower part is called the radicle. This will grow into the root of the plant. So, plumule goes into the shoot and radicle grows into the root of the plant. So, that is how a seed will start to germinate. So, cotyledon, as I said, in some plants you will have two cotyledons like this. Here are two cotyledons. In some plants you will have only one cotyledon, and that also you will study in your higher secondary if you take biology, that these cotyledons, based on the number of cotyledons a plant has, a plant can be divided into monocots or dicots. So, monocotyledonous plants and dicotyledonous plants. We will not talk about this because we do not have it in the syllabus. So, I hope you understand the flowering part of flowering plants, the flower part of the flowering plants, how the pollination takes place, what are the functions of the different parts of the flowers, and which part develops into what after fertilization. So, I hope you understood this video. If you have any questions, make sure you ask me in the comment section, and see you in the next one. Until next time, cheers.